One man, one ambition, one world that was never enough. Before the age of 33, Alexander had conquered kingdoms, destroyed empires, and marched farther than any Macedonian king before him. But conquest alone does not explain Alexander. Behind the victories was a man obsessed with glory, haunted by the shadow of his father, fascinated by Achilles, capable of extraordinary loyalty and terrifying violence. He loved deeply. He dreamed endlessly. He killed men he once trusted, and no matter how much of the world he possessed, he always wanted more. So who was Alexander when the armies were silent and the legends were stripped away? This is not the story of what Alexander conquered. This is the story of the man who needed to conquer. Long before Alexander became the Great, he was simply a son growing beneath the shadow of an extraordinary father. He was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. The kingdom Alexander entered was changing rapidly. Macedonia had once been regarded by many Greeks to the south as a rough kingdom on the edge of their world. Its kings spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and participated in Greek culture. Yet to the proud cities of Athens and Thebes, Macedonians could still seem distant, provincial, even barbaric. Alexander's father intended to change that. Philip II was not merely a king. He was a soldier, diplomat, strategist, politician, and perhaps, above all, a survivor. When Philip came to power, Macedonia was surrounded by enemies and threatened from within. By the time Alexander was old enough to understand the world around him, his father had transformed that vulnerable kingdom into the strongest military power in Greece. Philip reorganized the Macedonian army. He strengthened the phalanx, equipped his infantry with the enormous sarissa, developed cavalry tactics, built alliances, bribed enemies, broke promises when necessary, and fought when diplomacy failed. Victory followed victory. Cities submitted, rivals disappeared, Macedonia expanded, and Alexander watched. For another child, such a father might have been a source of security. For Alexander, Philip may also have represented something more difficult, a standard that seemed almost impossible to surpass. Ancient writers preserve stories of Alexander's competitiveness from an early age. When news arrived that Philip had won another battle or captured another city, Alexander was supposedly not always delighted. According to Plutarch, the young prince complained to his companions that his father would accomplish everything before Alexander had the chance to do anything great himself. Whether those exact words were spoken hardly matters. The story survived because it captured something people recognized in Alexander. Even as a boy, achievement was not enough. It had to be his achievement. He did not simply want to inherit greatness. He wanted greatness that belonged to him. One of the most famous stories from Alexander's childhood illustrates this perfectly. A powerful horse had been brought before Philip. Its name was Bucephalus. The animal was magnificent, expensive, and apparently impossible to control. Experienced men attempted to ride it and failed. The horse resisted them, reared, and frightened those who approached. Philip eventually ordered it taken away. Alexander objected. He believed the men were blaming the horse for their own inability to understand it. The boy had noticed something the adults had missed. Bucephalus appeared frightened by its own shadow. Alexander approached the animal, turned it toward the sun so the shadow disappeared from its sight, calmed it, and climbed onto its back. Then he rode. The story may have been polished by generations of retelling, but once again, its importance lies in what ancient writers believed it revealed about Alexander: observation, confidence, courage, and something more dangerous, the conviction that where other men failed, he would succeed. Philip, watching his son return on the horse, is said to have wept with pride. Then came the famous words, "My son, seek a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedonia is too small for you." Perhaps Philip never said them. History would make them seem prophetic anyway. There was affection between father and son. There was admiration. Alexander learned warfare in the world Philip created. He inherited the army Philip built, the officers Philip trained, the wealth Philip accumulated, and ultimately the invasion of Persia that Philip had already begun preparing. Without Philip II, there may never have been an Alexander the Great, but admiration between powerful men can easily become competition. And as Alexander grew older, their relationship became more complicated. They were similar in uncomfortable ways. Both were ambitious. Both were charismatic. Both could inspire extraordinary loyalty. Both could be ruthless. And both believed themselves capable of shaping the world around them. There was only one throne, and only one man could stand at the center of Macedonia. Their tension became painfully visible when Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was from Epirus. Alexander was Philip's legitimate heir, but a new Macedonian wife created an unsettling possibility. What if Cleopatra gave Philip another son, a son with two Macedonian parents? At the wedding feast, alcohol flowed freely. Then Cleopatra's uncle, Attalus, reportedly offered a toast expressing hope that the marriage would produce a legitimate heir to Macedonia. Alexander understood the insult immediately. He threw a cup at Attalus and demanded to know whether he considered Alexander a bastard. Philip rose, perhaps drunk, perhaps furious, perhaps both. He moved against his own son and fell. Alexander looked at the man who had conquered much of Greece lying on the floor. Then, according to Plutarch, he mocked him. Here is the man preparing to cross from Europe into Asia, who cannot even cross from one couch to another. It was more than a drunken family argument. For a moment, the private fracture inside the Macedonian royal family had become public. Alexander left Macedonia with his mother. Father and son would eventually reconcile, but something had changed. Alexander had grown up admiring Philip. Now he had also learned that his position could be threatened by him. Then, in 336 BC, everything changed again. Philip II entered a theatre at Aegia during celebrations for the marriage of his daughter. He walked without his bodyguards close around him, displaying his confidence before the assembled crowd. A man named Pausanias approached. He drew a blade and stabbed the king. Philip fell. The assassin attempted to escape but was killed by Philip's guards. Almost immediately, questions began. Why had Pausanias killed the king? Was he acting alone? Had someone encouraged him? Had Olympias known? Had Alexander? Ancient sources preserve accusations, suspicions, and rumors, but no convincing evidence proves that Alexander participated in his father's assassination. What mattered was what happened next. Philip II was dead. Alexander was 20 years old, and the shadow that had covered his entire childhood suddenly disappeared. But escaping Philip's shadow would prove more difficult than surviving Philip himself. Every victory would invite comparison. Every conquest would raise the same invisible question. Was Alexander merely completing his father's work? Or could he become something Philip had never been? He inherited Philip's throne, his army, his officers, his enemies, his plans for Persia. But perhaps Philip's most important inheritance was something Alexander could neither see nor spend, a standard he had to surpass. For 20 years, Alexander had lived beneath his father. Now Philip was gone, and Alexander finally had the chance to discover how far his own name could travel. But there was another influence waiting behind Philip's shadow. Philip had taught Alexander what power looked like. His mother had given him a far more dangerous idea, that perhaps he had been born for it, Olympias. If Philip taught Alexander that greatness had to be earned, Olympias may have taught him something very different, that greatness was already inside him. Alexander's mother was no ordinary Macedonian queen. Olympias came from Epirus, a kingdom to the west of Macedonia. She belonged to the Molossian royal house, a dynasty that claimed descent from Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. To a modern mind, such a claim belongs to mythology. To Alexander, it was part of his family identity. He grew up in a world where the boundary between history and myth was far less rigid than it seems to us. Heroes were not simply characters from old stories. They were ancestors, models, standards against which a life could be measured. And Olympias stood at the center of that world. Ancient sources portray her as passionate, politically ambitious, intensely religious, and sometimes frightening. But those portraits require caution. Many surviving accounts were written long after her lifetime, in societies deeply suspicious of powerful women. As Alexander's legend grew, stories surrounding his mother became increasingly dramatic. Snakes, prophecies, secret rituals, divine visions. Some may preserve fragments of truth. Others almost certainly grew with the mythology surrounding Alexander himself. Strip away the sensationalism, however, and one thing remains clear. Olympias was formidable, and her relationship with Alexander appears to have been extraordinarily close. Philip was frequently absent. He campaigned, negotiated, married for political advantage, spent years building the power Alexander would eventually inherit. Olympias remained a constant presence, and she seems to have encouraged in her son a powerful sense of identity. Alexander was not merely a Macedonian prince. He belonged to a heroic bloodline. He had been born into something exceptional. Later traditions pushed this idea much further. Before Alexander's birth, Olympias was said to have dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her womb and produced a great flame. Philip supposedly dreamed of sealing his wife's womb with the image of a lion. Another story claimed Philip once saw a serpent beside Olympias as she slept. And eventually came the most extraordinary story of all, that Alexander's true father was not Philip, but Zeus. There is no reason to treat these stories as literal history. Their importance lies elsewhere. Alexander became the kind of man around whom such stories could grow, and later in life, he himself would become increasingly interested in the idea that his identity extended beyond ordinary kingship. Whether Olympias actually told the young Alexander that he possessed divine blood is impossible to know, but the world in which she raised him made extraordinary destiny imaginable. Consider that world from the perspective of a child. His father was transforming Macedonia into a great power. His mother's family claimed descent from the heroes of Troy. Poets told of men whose names had survived for centuries. Priests spoke of gods who fathered children with mortals. Alexander did not grow up expecting an ordinary life, and that can be both a gift and a burden. At first, the belief that you are destined for greatness creates confidence. Eventually, it creates obligation. If you believe you were born for something extraordinary, then an ordinary existence can begin to feel like failure. Peace can feel like wasted time. Safety can feel like cowardice, and every achievement creates a new demand. You must now become worthy of the destiny you were promised. Philip gave Alexander something to surpass. Olympias may have given him a reason to believe that he could. His education reinforced that confidence. Philip made sure his son was trained not only as a warrior, but as a future king. Alexander learned to ride, hunt, fight, command, but he also studied literature, medicine, ethics, politics, and the natural world. For a time, his teacher was one of the most remarkable intellectual figures of the ancient world, Aristotle. Philip invited Aristotle to educate Alexander and a group of young Macedonian nobles at Mysa. It is one of those historical pairings that almost seems invented afterward. One of antiquity's most famous philosophers teaching the boy who would become its most famous conqueror. We should not imagine a modern classroom. This was an education designed for an elite prince. Alexander studied politics and ethics. He developed an interest in medicine and the natural world. He learned to think about different peoples and different forms of government. But among everything he read, one work appears to have occupied a special place in his imagination: Homer's Iliad. According to Plutarch, Aristotle prepared an annotated copy for Alexander, and Alexander later kept the poem close during his campaigns. The precise details may have been embellished. The larger pattern is difficult to miss. Alexander loved Homer, and one hero stood above the others: Achilles. There was already a family connection through Olympia's claimed ancestry, but Alexander's fascination became personal. Achilles represented courage, rage, loyalty, pride, and above all, glory. Alexander would eventually visit Troy and publicly associate himself with the hero. But that belongs to the next stage of his life. For now, what matters is what had been placed inside the young prince's imagination. Philip had shown him how kingdoms were built. Olympias had surrounded him with the possibility of extraordinary destiny. Aristotle had given structure to his education, and Homer gave him a model for what greatness could look like. Alexander was still young, still a prince, still waiting for his own story to begin. But the standards surrounding him were already enormous. A father who had transformed Macedonia, a mother whose dynasty claimed heroic blood, a teacher whose mind ranged across the known world, and a hero whose name had survived centuries after his death. There was almost no room in Alexander's imagination for an ordinary life. The question was no longer simply whether he would become king. He was born expecting that. The question was what kind of name he would leave behind. And Achilles offered an answer. Not a long life, not a peaceful one. A life that would be remembered. Alexander wanted many things: a kingdom, victory, Persia, eventually, perhaps, lands beyond anything his father had imagined. But beneath all of them was something more difficult to conquer. Time. Alexander understood something every king eventually discovers. Power disappears. Palaces collapse. Armies scatter. Even the greatest rulers die. But some names survive. Achilles had survived. For generations of Greeks, he remained the perfect warrior. Beautiful, fearless, terrifying, proud, capable of deep love and uncontrollable rage. He was not remembered because he lived wisely. He was remembered because he lived magnificently, and because he made the choice at the heart of the heroic ideal. In the Iliad, Achilles knows that two futures lie before him. He can return home and live a long life, but his glory will disappear. Or he can remain at Troy, die young, and win a name that will never fade. Achilles chooses glory. The Greeks had a word for it: Cleo's renown, the fame that survives after the body is gone, a kind of immortality available to mortal men. Alexander seems to have understood that bargain deeply, perhaps too deeply. But unlike Achilles, Alexander did not live in poetry. He had inherited an army, and in 336 BC, at only 20 years old, he inherited a kingdom. Before he could pursue glory abroad, however, he had to survive at home. Philip's death did not automatically make Alexander secure. Macedonian kingship was dangerous. There were potential rivals within the royal family. Powerful nobles commanded soldiers. Beyond Macedonia, Greek cities saw Philip's assassination as an opportunity to escape Macedonian control. The empire Alexander inherited could disappear before he had truly begun to rule it. His response revealed one of the defining characteristics of his career: speed. Alexander moved before his enemies could organize. He secured the support he needed inside Macedonia. Potential threats to his rule were eliminated. He marched south and forced the Greek states to recognize the authority Philip had established. Then trouble came from the north. Alexander campaigned in the Balkans, crossed difficult terrain, fought tribal forces, and demonstrated that the 20-year-old king was not merely a boy occupying his father's throne. Then a rumor spread. Alexander was dead. Thebes believed it. The city revolted. Alexander was far away. The Thebans probably expected time. Time to organize. Time to find allies. Time to prepare. Alexander gave them almost none. He marched south with extraordinary speed, and suddenly the supposedly dead king was standing outside their walls. Thebes refused to surrender. Alexander attacked. The city fell. What followed was brutal. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were enslaved. Much of the city was destroyed. Temples were spared, as was, according to tradition, the house of the poet but the message was unmistakable. Alexander could admire poetry, he could study philosophy, and he could erase a city. These qualities were not contradictions in his world. They were parts of the same man. This is important because Alexander is often divided into two convenient characters: Alexander the enlightened conqueror, or Alexander the violent tyrant. The historical man was more uncomfortable. He could show remarkable generosity toward defeated enemies. He could become fascinated by foreign customs. He could reward courage wherever he found it. And he could respond to resistance with terrifying violence. Thebes demonstrated another quality that would follow him throughout his life. Alexander understood fear. One spectacular punishment could prevent 10 future rebellions. After Thebes, Greece understood the cost of defiance. His position was secure. Now he could turn east, toward the dream Philip had never lived to pursue. Persia, the Persian Empire, was enormous. It stretched from Egypt and the Mediterranean deep into Asia. It possessed vast wealth, ancient cities, royal roads, experienced administrators, cavalry, fleets, and armies drawn from many peoples. For generations, Persia had existed in the Greek imagination as both enemy and giant. Philip had already planned an invasion, presenting it partly as retaliation for the Persian wars against Greece more than a century earlier. Alexander inherited that justification. He inherited the army. He inherited the commanders. He even inherited the war. But Persia offered Alexander something that Macedonia could not: a stage large enough for him to create greatness of his own. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia. He was approximately 22 years old. He would never see Macedonia again. One of his first symbolic destinations was Troy. Not because Troy was strategically important, because Achilles was there. Or at least, his memory was. Alexander visited the landscape associated with the Trojan War. According to ancient tradition, he honored the heroes and placed a wreath upon what was believed to be Achilles' tomb. His closest companion, Hephaestion, reportedly honored Patroclus nearby. The symbolism was unmistakable. Achilles and Alexander and Hephaestion, the ancient story and the living men. Alexander had spent his childhood reading Homer. Now he had stepped into Homer's landscape. He was no longer simply admiring the heroic past. He was beginning to place himself inside it. Tradition also says that Alexander took a sacred shield from the temple of Athena at Troy, which would later accompany him into battle. Again, symbolism mattered. Alexander understood military power extraordinarily well, but he also understood stories. A king was not merely a man who issued orders. A king could become an idea, and Alexander was already constructing the idea of Alexander. The young hero, the descendant of Achilles, the king crossing into Asia, the warrior who fought at the front rather than commanding from safety. That final image was not merely propaganda. Alexander repeatedly placed himself in genuine danger. At the Granicus, the first major battle of his Persian campaign, he personally entered the fighting. He was recognizable. His armor and position made him an obvious target. Persian nobles attacked him directly. A blow struck his helmet. Another enemy moved against him, and Cletus, the Black, intervened, saving Alexander from what might have been a fatal attack. The entire story of Alexander almost ended there. No Egypt, no God, no Persepolis, no India, no Alexander the Great, just a young Macedonian king dead beside a river during the opening phase of his invasion. Alexander survived, and then he won. This pattern would repeat itself. He would be wounded again and again throughout his campaigns. Swords, arrows, stones, sieges, close combat. Alexander knew a king was valuable. He knew a commander should survive, yet he continued placing himself where death was most likely. Part of the explanation was practical. Macedonian kings were expected to demonstrate personal courage. Alexander's presence at the front inspired his soldiers. He did not ask men to enter dangers. He would never approach himself. But there was something more. Alexander did not merely want to command heroes. He wanted to be one. Achilles did not watch the battle from a distant hill. Achilles entered it. Alexander demanded the same from himself, and every time he survived, something dangerous happened. Risk produced victory. Victory justified risk. Survival encouraged another risk. For most men, nearly dying teaches caution. For Alexander, it may have taught the opposite lesson, that he could go farther. Cities across Asia Minor began falling. Some resisted. Others opened their gates. Alexander continued deeper into Persian territory. Then, at Gordium, he encountered another story. An ancient wagon was bound by an elaborate knot. Tradition claimed that whoever could undo it would become ruler of Asia. Ancient accounts disagree about precisely how Alexander solved the problem. The famous version says he drew his sword and cut through the knot. Whether he actually did so is less important than why the story survived. It sounded like Alexander. Other men saw a puzzle. Alexander saw an obstacle, and obstacles existed to be overcome. Then came Darius III, the great king. For the first time, Alexander would face not merely Persian governors or regional forces, but the ruler of the empire himself. At Issus in 333 BC, they met. Alexander won. Darius fled. His family was left behind. His mother, his wife, his children, they fell into Alexander's hands. Alexander treated them with remarkable respect. This was not necessarily simple kindness. It was also intelligent kingship. Darius's family represented royal legitimacy. Alexander could behave not like a raider destroying civilization, but like a king capable of inheriting it. Yet the personal significance of Issus was impossible to ignore. Philip had never defeated the great king. Alexander had. The prince who once worried that his father would leave him nothing great to accomplish had forced the ruler of Persia from the battlefield. For the first time, Philip's shadow was beginning to look smaller. But Achilles' shadow remained, because Alexander had not crossed into Asia merely to win one battle. Darius was alive. Persia still stood, and glory has a dangerous quality. It has no natural finish line. There is always another achievement, another story, another name from the past to surpass. Achilles had achieved immortality by dying at Troy. Alexander intended to find another way. He would keep winning, keep moving, keep expanding the boundaries of what one human life could contain. And with every victory, the distance between Alexander and ordinary men would grow. Soon, defeating kings would no longer be enough. Alexander would begin to wonder whether all these victories meant something more, whether he was merely fortunate or favored. Victory changes a man. One victory gives confidence, another creates expectation. But what happens when victory becomes normal? By the time Alexander left the battlefield at Issus, he had already achieved what many kings would have considered the triumph of a lifetime. He had crossed into Asia, defeated Persian forces at the Granicus, taken city after city, and finally faced Darius III himself. The great king had fled. His family was now in Alexander's hands. His prestige had been wounded. For most commanders, this would have been the moment to negotiate from strength. For Alexander, it was only the beginning. Darius offered terms. Ancient sources preserve different versions of the negotiations, but the general picture is clear. The Persian king was prepared to surrender territory, wealth, and perhaps a marriage alliance in exchange for peace and the return of his family. One famous tradition claims that when the Macedonian general Parmenion heard the offer, he said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander supposedly replied, "So would I." If I were Parmenion, the exchange may have been polished by later writers, but few stories capture Alexander's personality so perfectly. Parmenion saw an extraordinary settlement. Alexander saw a limit, and Alexander did not like limits. He did not want part of the Persian Empire. He wanted the empire. Perhaps by this point, accepting half would have felt less like success than surrender, because ambition has a strange ability to redefine victory. The thing that once seemed impossible becomes insufficient the moment it is achieved. Before pursuing Darius deeper into Persia, Alexander turned south. This was not reckless ambition, it was strategy. The Persian fleet remained dangerous in the Mediterranean, and as long as Persia controlled important coastal cities, Alexander's position remained vulnerable. So he moved down the Phoenician coast. Many cities submitted. One did not. Tyre. Tyre was one of the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean. Its main city stood on an island just offshore, protected by walls and sea. Alexander demanded entry. The Tyrians refused. They had reason to believe they were safe. Alexander possessed a powerful army, but armies cannot march across water. For 7 months, Tyre resisted him. It was the kind of obstacle another commander might simply have bypassed. Alexander changed the geography. His engineers began constructing a causeway from the mainland toward the island. Stone, timber, earth, everything that could extend the land into the sea. The Tyrians fought back. They burned Macedonian siege works, attacked the construction, used their ships and walls to make every meter costly. Alexander adapted. He assembled a fleet. Siege engines moved closer. The pressure increased. Eventually, the walls were breached. Macedonian troops entered the city. What followed was devastating. Ancient estimates vary, but large numbers of Tyrians were killed and many others enslaved. The city that had resisted Alexander for months paid an enormous price. Tyre reveals two Alexanders at once. The first is extraordinary, patient, inventive, unwilling to accept a problem simply because no obvious solution exists. The second is terrifying, a man for whom prolonged resistance could become personal. Alexander could show mercy when surrender served his purpose, but defiance could provoke something much darker. And Tyre taught him the same lesson that so many of his victories had already taught him. When the world says no, push harder. Eventually, the answer may change. That lesson can create greatness. It can also create a man who no longer recognizes when he should stop. From Tyre, Alexander continued south. Gaza resisted and fell. Then the road opened toward Egypt. There, Alexander encountered something different. No great battle waited for him. Egypt had been under Persian rule, and Alexander entered the country with little resistance. He was recognized according to Egyptian royal tradition. He became pharaoh. Once again, Alexander demonstrated an important characteristic. He could adapt. He did not insist that every conquered people become Macedonian. He participated in local religious traditions. He used existing systems when they served his rule. He could destroy resistance without believing that conquest required destroying every culture he encountered. This flexibility would become essential to his empire. But every new kingdom also gave Alexander another identity: King of Macedonia, leader of the Greek alliance, conqueror in Asia, Pharaoh of Egypt. The titles accumulated, and so did the story Alexander could tell about himself. Near the Mediterranean coast, he chose the site for a new city, Alexandria. It would not be the only city associated with his name, but it would become the greatest. Alexander could not know what Alexandria would eventually become, one of the Mediterranean world's great centers of trade, scholarship, and culture. But naming a city after himself carried obvious symbolism. He was not simply passing through history. He intended to leave something behind. The pursuit of Cleos was becoming physical. A name could now exist on a map. Yet Alexander's most psychologically important journey in Egypt took him away from cities, into the desert. Far west of the Nile stood the oasis of Siwa and the famous oracle of Ammon, whom the Greeks associated with Zeus. Alexander made the difficult journey to the sanctuary. Later stories surrounded the expedition with miracles. Rain supposedly arrived when water was desperately needed. Animals appeared to guide the travelers. The desert itself seemed to confirm divine favor. Much of this may belong to legend. What happened inside the sanctuary is equally uncertain. Ancient traditions disagree about Alexander's questions and the oracle's answers. Some claimed he asked whether Philip's murderers had been punished. Others said he asked whether he would rule the world. And eventually stories emerged that the oracle confirmed Alexander's divine parentage. Son of Zeus. We cannot know precisely what Alexander was told, but after Siwa, the association between Alexander and divinity became increasingly visible. And the timing matters. He had grown up surrounded by stories of heroic ancestry. He had survived dangers that could easily have killed him. He had defeated the great king, taken Tyre, entered Egypt, become pharaoh. Now an ancient oracle had received him in the desert. How many times can fortune favor one man before he begins to wonder whether fortune is really accidental? Alexander left Egypt and turned east again. Darius was still alive. The Persian Empire was wounded, but not destroyed. The decisive confrontation came in 331 BC near Gaugamela. Darius had prepared carefully. The terrain favored his forces. The Persian army was large and diverse. Ancient sources give enormous numbers that are almost certainly exaggerated, but Darius appears to have possessed numerical superiority. Alexander faced the greatest battle of his life. If he lost, everything could collapse. He was thousands of kilometers from Macedonia. Enemies could rise behind him. His reputation for invincibility could disappear in a single afternoon. Alexander attacked. The tactics of Gaugamela have been studied for centuries. The maneuvering, the cavalry, the opening Alexander exploited in the Persian line. But for the story of Alexander, the man, one moment matters above all. Darius fled. Again, the Persian army broke. Alexander had won. After Gaugamela, the question was no longer whether he could survive in Asia. The question was how much of Asia would become his. Babylon opened its gates. Then Susa, treasuries containing unimaginable wealth, fell into his hands. The young king who had crossed the Hellespont was becoming one of the richest and most powerful men alive. Then came Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander stood inside the palaces of the great kings. The competition with Philip was effectively over. Philip had dominated Greece. Alexander had broken Persia. Philip had planned to invade Asia. Alexander stood inside Persepolis. His father could no longer be the standard, and that created a new problem. Once you become greater than the man you spent your youth trying to surpass, what comes next? At Persepolis, part of the palace complex was burned. Ancient writers give different explanations. Some describe a drunken celebration in which Ty encouraged Alexander to burn the palace as revenge for Persian destruction in Greece generations earlier. Others have seen political symbolism in the act. The old Persian order had fallen. The precise motivation remains uncertain. Later tradition even suggested that Alexander regretted what he had done. Whatever happened, the episode reveals a tension that would become increasingly important. Alexander could be extraordinarily calculating and extraordinarily impulsive. The man capable of planning campaigns across continents did not always possess the same control over his own emotions. But an even greater danger was emerging. There were fewer people left who could tell him he was wrong. When Alexander was a prince, Philip stood above him. When he became king, older generals still represented another generation. But victory was changing everything. His companions had watched him attempt things they believed impossible, and succeed, again and again. Disagreement becomes difficult around a man who is almost always proven right. That may have been victory's most dangerous gift. Alexander's confidence was no longer based on imagination. Reality supported it. He believed Persia could be invaded. He invaded it. He believed Tyre could be taken. It fell. He believed Darius could be defeated. Darius fled. At some point, confidence stops being something you possess. It becomes part of who you are. And for Alexander, something else may have been happening. The victories were beginning to feel like evidence. Evidence that his mother's stories had not been meaningless. Evidence that Siwa had not been an accident. Evidence that perhaps he really was different. A normal person learns limits through failure. Alexander had experienced remarkably little of it. Instead, success kept teaching him the same lesson. Go farther, and Alexander listened. Darius was running out of places to hide. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire still existed geographically, but its center had collapsed. Babylon had opened its gates. Susa had surrendered its treasures. Persepolis had fallen. Yet Darius III remained alive. And as long as the great king lived, Alexander's victory was incomplete. So Alexander followed him east, farther from Macedonia, farther from Greece, farther into a world his soldiers barely knew. The pursuit ended differently than Alexander expected. Darius was betrayed by his own men. In 330 BC, as Alexander closed the distance, Persian nobles led by Bessus seized their king. When Macedonian forces approached, Darius was mortally wounded and abandoned. Alexander arrived too late. His greatest enemy was dying. According to later accounts, Alexander covered Darius with his own cloak and ordered that he receive a royal burial. Whether every detail happened exactly as later writers described it, Alexander's political response was clear. Darius would not be remembered simply as his enemy. Alexander would present himself as his successor. The traitors who murdered Darius could now become Alexander's enemies. The conqueror could avenge the king he had defeated. It was politically brilliant, and it marked a transformation. Alexander had entered Asia as the king of Macedonia, fighting the Persian Empire. Now there was no Persian king, only Alexander. The question was no longer whether he could defeat Persia. It was what kind of ruler he would become once he possessed it. His answer unsettled many Macedonians. Alexander began adopting elements of Persian royal dress and court ceremony. He retained Macedonian practices as well. What emerged was not simply Persian imitation. It was a mixture: Macedonian, Greek, Persian, Egyptian. Alexander was trying to rule an empire, too large to remain culturally Macedonian. The political logic was strong. Millions of his new subjects had never been Macedonian and never would be. Persian nobles possessed administrative experience, local influence and networks Alexander needed, so he incorporated them. Persians received positions. Existing systems continued where useful. Later, Persian soldiers would enter Alexander's military structure. To Alexander, this may have looked like the future. To some Macedonians, it looked like betrayal. They had crossed into Asia to defeat Persia. Now their king dressed partly like a Persian ruler and surrounded himself with Persian elites. The soldiers could accept Alexander ruling Persians. What troubled them was the possibility that Persia was changing Alexander, and underneath the cultural conflict was something even more personal: distance, traditional. Macedonian kingship allowed powerful nobles a degree of familiarity with their king. They drank with him, argued with him, fought beside him. Some of Alexander's senior officers had known him since childhood. They had served Philip. They remembered when Alexander was simply a prince. Persian court culture offered a different model. The great king stood at the center of elaborate hierarchy and ceremony. Approaching him could involve ritualized gestures of submission. Alexander increasingly occupied that world. The boy who once needed to prove himself to Philip was now surrounded by men who bowed before him. That changes the atmosphere around any human being. Fewer jokes, fewer contradictions, fewer people willing to say no. The controversy became especially visible around Persia. In Persian court culture, forms of bowing or prostration expressed hierarchy and respect. For Greeks and Macedonians, however, similar gestures could carry religious associations. They bowed in such ways before gods, not kings. Alexander appears to have experimented with introducing the practice among his mixed court. For Persian subjects, it could preserve familiar royal ceremony. For Macedonians, it crossed a boundary. One prominent critic was Callisthenes, the Greek historian connected to Aristotle who had accompanied Alexander's expedition. Ancient accounts describe an occasion on which Callisthenes refused to perform the gesture. The details may have been embellished, but the tension was real. Alexander's court was changing. Not everyone wanted to change with it. Callisthenes later became caught in the aftermath of a conspiracy involving royal pages. His exact involvement remains uncertain. He was arrested. He died in captivity. It would be easy to interpret all of this as a simple story of a king going mad with power. Reality was more complicated. Alexander faced a genuine political problem. He could not govern Asia as though it were merely an enlarged Macedonia. Adopting Persian elites and customs could make him appear legitimate to Persian subjects. The same policies made him appear increasingly foreign to the Macedonians who had placed him on the throne. Alexander stood between worlds. And perhaps he began to believe that the only identity large enough to contain all of them was Alexander himself, king of Macedonia, pharaoh, great king's son, perhaps of Zeus. There was no longer anyone above him. For most of his life, Alexander had always possessed someone to surpass. Philip, Achilles, Darius. Now Philip was dead. Darius was dead. Persia belonged to him. If no earthly king stood above Alexander, what remained? We cannot know exactly what Alexander believed about his own divinity. Ancient ideas of kingship and divine ancestry do not fit neatly into modern categories. He may have treated some divine claims politically, some symbolically, perhaps some sincerely. The more revealing question is not whether Alexander literally believed himself to be a god. It is whether years of extraordinary success were teaching him that ordinary rules did not fully apply to him. That transformation requires no religion. Power alone can create it, and power was becoming increasingly personal. The campaigns continued east into Bactria and Sogdiana. Here, Alexander encountered a different kind of war. No single battle could end it. There was no Darius whose defeat would make everything collapse. Instead, there were mountain fortresses, local rebellions, ambushes, long distances, guerrilla resistance. The glamorous war against the great king became something harsher. Occupation, suppression, endless campaigning, and suspicion. In 330 BC, Alexander learned of an alleged conspiracy against his life. The investigation eventually focused on Philotas commanded the companion cavalry. He was powerful, prestigious, and the son of Parmenion. Philotas apparently knew something about the alleged conspiracy and failed to report it directly to Alexander. Whether he actually participated remains uncertain. He was arrested, interrogated, condemned, and executed. Then Alexander faced another problem. Parmenion, the old general, was far away. There was no clear evidence that he had participated in the plot, but he commanded troops, controlled important resources, possessed enormous prestige, and had just lost his son to an execution ordered by Alexander. Alexander made a cold calculation. Parmenion could not be allowed time to react. Orders were sent. The old general was killed before he could learn the full story. It was ruthless. Perhaps Alexander believed it necessary. Perhaps, politically, he was right to fear what Parmenion might do. We cannot know, but something important had changed. Parmenion had served Philip. He had helped build the military system Alexander inherited. He represented the old Macedonia. Now he was gone. One by one, the men who remembered Alexander before he became the conqueror of Asia were disappearing. And the fewer such men remained, the fewer people could speak to him without seeing the great king first. One of those men was Cletus, the Black. Cletus had fought beside Alexander for years. At the Granicus, He had saved Alexander's life. Without Cletus, the story might have ended before it truly began. There would have been no Egypt, no Gaugamela, no Persepolis. Alexander owed Cletus his life, and Cletus knew Alexander from the old world. Before Persian clothing, before Siwa, before men bowed, before Alexander became the ruler of Asia, that made Cletus valuable. It also made him dangerous in a way no Persian enemy could be. Cletus remembered who Alexander used to be. In 328 BC, Alexander and his companions gathered for a banquet at They drank. Conversation turned toward Alexander's achievements. Praise became extravagant. According to ancient accounts, the accomplishments of Philip and the older generation were diminished while Alexander was elevated. Cletus objected. He defended Philip. He defended the Macedonian soldiers whose blood had built Alexander's victories. He refused to participate in the idea that Alexander had done everything alone. The argument escalated. Years of tension entered the room. Cletus criticized Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs. He mocked the people who treated the king as something more than human. And then he reminded Alexander of something perhaps no one else dared to say. He had saved his life. For Alexander, this may have struck at exactly the wrong place. The ruler of Asia was being reminded that once, before all the titles and victories, he had been a young man who needed another man's hand to survive. Alexander lost control. Those around him attempted to intervene. Weapons were removed. Cletus was pushed or led away. For a moment, the disaster might still have ended, but the argument continued. Ancient accounts differ on the precise sequence. The outcome does not. Alexander seized a weapon and killed Cletus. The man who had once saved Alexander's life died by Alexander's hand. Then the anger disappeared, and Alexander was left with the body. This is what makes the death of Cletus so important. Alexander had ordered executions before. He had destroyed cities. He had killed enemies in battle. But Cletus was not an enemy. He was part of Alexander's own past, and almost immediately, Alexander appears to have understood the horror of what he had done. Ancient writers describe overwhelming grief. He withdrew, refused food, called himself the murderer of his friends. Some accounts even claim he attempted to turn a weapon against himself and had to be restrained. The precise details may have grown in the telling, but Alexander's remorse appears genuine, and that matters, because the scene does not reveal a man incapable of feeling guilt. It reveals something more complicated, a man capable of recognizing his own violence after it was too late. Alexander could conquer cities, command armies, discipline thousands of soldiers, but sometimes he could not govern the few seconds between humiliation, anger, and action. There is a cruel irony in that. As Alexander's control over the external world expanded, moments of internal control could become more dangerous. He was great king, pharaoh, conqueror of Persia, associated with Zeus. None of those titles could bring Cletus back, and none could protect Alexander from himself. The campaign continued. Of course it did. Alexander always continued. He eventually married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. The marriage may have involved personal attraction, political calculation, or both. It also reflected the direction in which Alexander's empire was moving. Less purely Macedonian, more integrated, more imperial. But his Macedonian companions were watching their king change. His clothes, his court, his army, his relationships with Asian elites. Perhaps Alexander believed he was building the future, Perhaps some of his soldiers believed they were losing the man they had followed from Macedonia. Both may have been right. And beyond the mountains lay India, a land that occupied the distant edge of Greek and Macedonian geographical imagination. There was no Darius waiting there, no Persian Empire left to destroy, no unfinished war inherited from Philip. Alexander had already achieved everything that once seemed necessary. He had surpassed his father, defeated the great king, taken the Persian throne, reached farther than any Macedonian king before him. There was no longer anything he needed to prove. And still, he turned east, because by now Alexander's greatest challenge was no longer defeating an enemy. It was accepting the possibility that there might be no reason to keep going. Soon, at the edge of his world, his own soldiers would force him to confront that possibility. India was not part of Philip's unfinished war. There was no Persian king waiting there to be defeated, no Greek city to avenge, no throne Alexander needed in order to prove that he had surpassed his father. By the time he moved toward the Indian subcontinent, the original reasons for the campaign had largely disappeared. Persia had fallen. Darius was dead. Alexander ruled an empire larger than anything Philip had imagined. He could have stopped. He did not. And perhaps nowhere in his life is the central question of Alexander's character clearer. Why? The easy answer is ambition. But by now, ambition had become something more complicated. For years, Alexander had awakened with a destination ahead of him. A river to cross, a city to take, a king to defeat, a mountain beyond the horizon. Movement had become the natural condition of his life. Stopping would require something different from him. He would have to govern what he had already conquered. Sit in palaces, listen to administrators, settle disputes, collect taxes, build institutions, become not merely a conqueror, but a ruler. Alexander was capable of administration. His campaigns themselves demonstrate extraordinary organizational ability. But administration did not offer what conquest did. No charge, no impossible wall. No moment in which the entire world seemed to narrow into a single test of courage. Alexander belonged on the road, or perhaps, by this point, he no longer knew who he was without it. And the road led east. To Greeks and Macedonians, India existed near the edge of geography and imagination. Knowledge of the region was incomplete. Observation mixed with stories. There were accounts of extraordinary wealth, unfamiliar peoples, enormous rivers, strange animals and kingdoms farther east. For Alexander, uncertainty had rarely been a reason to turn back. It was an invitation. In 327 BC, his forces moved through the mountainous regions toward the Indus. The campaign was difficult. Fortresses had to be taken. Local resistance was fierce. Terrain could be as dangerous as armies. At Aornos, Alexander attacked a formidable mountain stronghold associated in later tradition with the failure of Heracles himself. Whether Alexander truly understood the campaign as a competition with Heracles is impossible to know, but the story suited the man he had become. Even the dead could serve as rivals. Aornos fell. Alexander continued. Then, in 326 BC, he reached the Hydaspes River. On the opposite side waited King Porus, and with Porus came something that Macedonians had rarely faced on this scale. War elephants. 2 soldiers and horses unfamiliar with them. Elephants could be terrifying. They broke formations. Frightened cavalry crushed men beneath their weight. And before Alexander could fight them, he had to cross the river. Porus guarded the opposite bank. A direct crossing would expose Alexander's men while they were vulnerable in the water. So Alexander used deception. For days, Macedonian troops moved along the river. Cavalry appeared at different locations. Noise suggested preparations. Porus was forced to watch multiple possible crossing points. Then, under cover of darkness and poor weather, Alexander moved a selected force upstream. He crossed. Porus reacted. The battle began. It was brutal. The elephants disrupted the Macedonian formations. Horses panicked. Men were crushed. Wounded animals became uncontrollable. Mud, blood, and noise transformed the battlefield. But Alexander adapted. His cavalry attacked the enemy wings. The Macedonians isolated and exhausted the elephants. Eventually, Porus' army broke. Alexander had won again. What followed became one of the most famous stories of his career. Porus was brought before him. He had fought courageously. He had been defeated and wounded, but not humiliated. Alexander reportedly asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus answered, like a king. Alexander asked whether he wanted anything more. Porus supposedly replied that everything was contained in those words. Like a king, Alexander respected the answer. Porus was restored to authority and eventually received additional territory under Alexander's rule. The conversation may have been shaped by later writers, but it reflects a repeated feature of Alexander's character. He admired courage, especially courage he recognized in himself. A defeated enemy who had fought magnificently could sometimes earn something surrender alone could not: respect. Alexander's morality was the morality of a warrior aristocrat. It could be brutal, but courage mattered, and Porus had demonstrated it. This was Alexander at his most effective: violent in battle, pragmatic afterward, capable of turning an enemy into an ally. But around this period came a more personal loss. Bucephalus died. Ancient accounts disagree about whether the horse died from wounds or old age. Whatever the exact cause, Alexander had lost one of the last living connections to his youth. The horse he had supposedly understood when other men could not. The horse associated with Philip's famous prediction. The animal that had carried him through years of conquest. Alexander founded a city bearing Bucephalus' name. There is something revealing in the gesture. Alexander could order terrible violence, and he could become deeply attached. Those qualities existed inside the same man. His emotions rarely appear small: love, anger, grief, pride, loyalty, ambition. Alexander did very little in moderation. Then the army continued east, and the world changed. Rain, humidity, mud, enormous rivers. The monsoon transformed the landscape. Equipment deteriorated. Animals struggled. Men became sick. And the Macedonians were tired. Not tired after one battle. Tired after years. Some of these men had crossed into Asia with Alexander in 334 BC. They had fought at the Granicus Issus, Tyre, Gaugamela. They had marched through Persia, across Central Asia, over mountains, through deserts. They had watched friends die thousands of kilometers from home, and Alexander wanted them to continue. Ahead lay the Ganges basin and reports of powerful kingdoms with large armies and many elephants. Ancient numbers were almost certainly exaggerated. The psychological effect was real. More rivers, more battles, more marching, more graves. And beyond them, no one knew. For Alexander, the unknown still meant possibility. For his soldiers, it meant there might never be an end. This was the difference that had been growing between king and army. Alexander measured the journey by what remained to be achieved. His soldiers measured it by how far they were from home. Alexander saw another kingdom. They saw another campaign. Alexander saw history. They saw rain. Alexander wanted another horizon. His men wanted Macedonia. At the Hephaestion River, they finally stopped. Alexander ordered preparations to continue east. The army refused. Not an enemy, not a rebellious city. His own men, the soldiers who had followed him farther than any Macedonian army had ever marched, would go no farther. Alexander spoke to them. He reminded them of what they had accomplished together. He described the lands ahead. He appealed to their courage, their pride, their loyalty. For years, words like these had worked. Alexander had persuaded men to climb walls, cross deserts, charge larger armies, enter worlds they barely understood. This time, they remained silent. Then Coenus, one of his senior officers, spoke. His message was respectful, but unmistakable. The soldiers had given enough. Many were dead. Those who remained wanted to see their families. They had followed Alexander beyond anything that could reasonably have been demanded of them. It was time to go home. Alexander reacted badly. Perhaps anger was part of it, perhaps humiliation. But there was something deeper. This was not simply a disagreement over strategy. For Alexander's entire adult life, one relationship had remained almost absolute. He led, they followed. At the Granicus, they followed. At Tyre, they followed. At Gaugamela, they followed. Through mountains, deserts, rebellions, elephants, they followed. Now Alexander set forward, and nothing happened. He withdrew. According to ancient accounts, he waited for days. Perhaps he expected the soldiers to reconsider. Perhaps he believed silence and shame would break their resistance. Perhaps he simply did not know what to do with the word no. The army did not change its mind. Alexander sought favorable omens for continuing. They did not come. Finally, he announced that they would turn back. It was not a battlefield defeat. No enemy had broken his army. No king had forced him to retreat. Something more important had happened. Alexander had discovered that his will had limits. For years, the world had taught him that resistance could be overcome if he pushed hard enough. Tyre said no. He built a road into the sea. Persia resisted. He destroyed its armies. Mountains stood before him. He crossed them. At the Hephaestion, Alexander pushed, and the answer remained no. The world had finally given him a boundary he could not conquer. Before leaving, Alexander ordered enormous altars constructed. They marked the eastern limit of his advance. If he could not continue, the landscape would at least remember that he had reached it. Then the army began moving south along the river systems toward the Indian Ocean. But turning back did not make Alexander cautious. During an assault against the Malians, he performed one of the most reckless acts of his career. Macedonian troops were attacking a fortified city. Alexander climbed the wall. The soldiers behind him struggled to follow. Ladders broke. For a moment, the king of an enormous empire stood exposed above an enemy city. He could have waited. He jumped inside. Only a handful of men managed to follow him. Enemy soldiers surrounded them. Alexander fought. Then an arrow struck him in the chest. It penetrated deeply. Alexander collapsed. For a moment, the entire story almost ended there. Not at Gaugamela, not fighting Darius, not at the edge of India. Inside an obscure fortified city, because Alexander had been unable to wait for his own army. His soldiers believed he was dying. They stormed the city in fury. Alexander was carried away. Removing the arrow was dangerous. His condition was severe. Rumors spread that the king was dead. Eventually, Alexander recovered enough to appear before his men. They needed to see him. Not a letter, not a general speaking on his behalf. Alexander, when he appeared alive, the army erupted. Men shouted, cried, reached toward him. These were the same soldiers who had refused him at the Hephaestion. They were exhausted by Alexander, sometimes angry with him, sometimes frightened by what his ambition demanded. And still they loved him. That was one of Alexander's greatest powers. Not obedience, attachment. He shared their marches, their thirst, their wounds, their danger. He demanded too much from them, but he demanded it while standing beside them. The arrow should have reminded Alexander of something obvious. He was not Achilles, not Heracles, not Zeus. He was flesh. A few centimeters could end everything, but survival had taught Alexander the wrong lesson too many times. He survived again. The return west offered several possible routes. Alexander led part of his forces through the Gedrosian desert. The reasons remained debated. There were strategic and logistical considerations. Ancient writers also connected the decision to stories of earlier rulers who had suffered attempting the same region. Whatever combination of motives drove him, the result was disastrous. Heat consumed the army. Water disappeared. Food became scarce. Animals died. Men collapsed. Supplies were lost. The desert did what armies had repeatedly failed to do. It punished Alexander's refusal to respect limits. One famous story from the march captures why his soldiers continued following him despite everything. A group of men found a small amount of water, barely enough for one person. They carried it to Alexander in a helmet. The army watched. Alexander was thirsty too. He took the helmet and poured the water onto the ground. If his men could not drink, neither would he. According to the story, the gesture restored their morale. Whether every detail happened exactly this way, the story expresses something essential about Alexander's leadership. He demanded suffering, but he was willing to suffer. He did not command hardship from a distant palace. He stood inside it. That was one of his greatest strengths, and one of his greatest dangers. Because a man capable of enduring almost anything can begin to believe everyone else should endure it too. Alexander emerged from Gedrosian. Many of his people did not. By now he had discovered several kinds of limits. His soldiers could refuse him. His body could be broken. His judgment could kill the men who trusted him. Yet there was still one relationship in his life that had survived almost everything. Before Persia, before Egypt, before Siwa, before Alexander became great king, there had been Hephaestion. And when the world increasingly saw a conqueror, a pharaoh, perhaps even something divine, Hephaestion could still remember the man. Soon, Alexander would lose him too. Alexander had generals, companions, officers, wives, advisors, thousands of soldiers who would follow him into battle. He had conquered peoples who bowed before him, but Hephaestion occupied a different place. He knew Alexander before the world did. Their early relationship is imperfectly documented, but Hephaestion belonged to Alexander's generation and became his closest companion during the campaigns. As Alexander's empire expanded, Hephaestion's importance expanded with it. He received military commands, diplomatic responsibilities, political assignments. He was not always the most celebrated battlefield commander in Alexander's army. Others possessed greater independent military reputations. But Hephaestion had something Alexander increasingly lacked: trust that mattered more with every passing year. Philip was dead. Darius was dead. Parmenion had been killed. Philotas had been executed. Cletus had died by Alexander's hand. Callisthenes had died in captivity. Some older Macedonians distrusted Alexander's changing court. Others feared contradicting him. Many depended on him. Hephaestion remained, and this is why their relationship matters. Almost everyone who approached Alexander eventually wanted something: money, office, protection, land, mercy, promotion. A king can be surrounded by thousands of people and still have very few. Relationships that are not shaped by power. The larger Alexander became, the more difficult equality became. Hephaestion may have been one of the last people capable of giving him something power could not create: familiarity. He knew the person who existed before the titles, before great king, before Pharaoh, before Zeus, before Alexander became a story. Ancient writers repeatedly connect Alexander and Hephaestion with Achilles and Patroclus. At Troy, Alexander reportedly honored Achilles, while Hephaestion honored Patroclus. The symbolism was deliberate. The heroic pair Alexander had admired since youth became a model through which his own closest relationship could be understood. Modern readers naturally ask whether Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers. The surviving evidence does not allow a simple answer. Ancient Greek and Macedonian ideas of friendship, intimacy, and sexuality do not fit neatly into modern categories. Trying to force their relationship into one can create more certainty than the evidence allows. What is clear is more important. Alexander loved Hephaestion deeply, and Hephaestion occupied a place no one else appears to have replaced. He was not simply useful to Alexander. He belonged to Alexander's emotional world. By the final years of the campaign, this relationship had also become political. Alexander was attempting to solve the central problem of his empire. How could a relatively small Macedonian ruling class govern enormous territories populated by millions of people who had once belonged to Persia? Alexander's answer increasingly involved integration. Persian nobles entered imperial administration. Persian soldiers were trained in Macedonian methods. Existing elites were incorporated rather than universally removed, and marriage became part of the project. At Susa in 324 BC, Alexander organized mass marriages between members of the Macedonian elite and Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself married Statera, a daughter of Darius III. Hephaestion married Drapetis, another daughter of Darius. The symbolism was difficult to miss. The conquerors and the conquered were being tied together. Alexander and Hephaestion were now connected by marriage to the dynasty they had defeated. Perhaps Alexander imagined this as the foundation of something new. Not Macedonia ruling Persia, not Persia absorbing Macedonia, an imperial elite containing both. Hephaestion stood near the center of that vision. But many Macedonian soldiers did not share Alexander's enthusiasm. They had followed him into Asia as conquerors. Now Persians were entering the army. Persian nobles stood close to the king. Persian customs appeared at court. The distinction between victor and defeated was becoming less clear. Alexander saw integration. Some Macedonians saw replacement. Their resentment exploded at Opis. When Alexander announced plans to send older and wounded Macedonian veterans home, the soldiers interpreted the decision through years of suspicion. They mutinied. Once again, Alexander faced resistance from his own men. His reaction was furious. He confronted them. Ringleaders were seized. Then Alexander reminded the army of everything Philip and he had done for Macedonia. Ancient writers shaped the speech, but its emotional core is revealing. Alexander did not speak like a distant emperor. He spoke almost like a wounded companion. I marched with you. I fought with you. I was wounded with you. I made you wealthy. How can you believe I would abandon you? Then he did something psychologically devastating. He turned away from them. Persians were elevated. Persian units received honors and Macedonian military titles. Alexander appeared willing to build the future without the men who had followed him from Europe. The Macedonians broke. They returned, begged for reconciliation. Some cried. Alexander cried too. Eventually, king and army reconciled. A great feast followed, bringing Macedonians and Persians together. Alexander prayed for harmony between the peoples of his empire. Whatever we think of his methods, the political idea appears to have been real. He was trying to create something that had not existed before, but the scene at Opus revealed another truth. Alexander still needed his Macedonians, and they still needed him. Power had not erased emotion from their relationship. It had made it more complicated. Through all of this, Hephaestion remained beside him. He adapted to Alexander's imperial vision when many others resisted it. He could belong to the old world and participate in the new one. Perhaps that was why Alexander trusted him so completely. Hephaestion was not simply a companion from the past. He was part of the future Alexander imagined. Then, suddenly, there was no future for him. In late 324 BC, Alexander and his court were at Ecbatana. Games and festivals were being held. The empire was still moving. Armies were being reorganized. New plans were forming. Alexander was 32. Hephaestion became ill. Ancient accounts differ about the details. He developed a fever. Treatment was attempted. His condition worsened, and then he died. There was no battle, no assassin, no heroic final stand. A man who had survived years of war died from illness. Alexander could do nothing. That may have been the unbearable part. Enemies could be fought. Walls could be breached. Conspiracies could be punished. Rivers could be crossed. A fever offered no opponent. No strategy, no charge, no one to defeat. Hephaestion was simply gone. Alexander collapsed into grief. Ancient accounts describe mourning on an extraordinary scale. He cut his hair, echoing Achilles after the death of Patroclus. The comparison Alexander had embraced at Troy now returned in the cruelest possible form. As a young man, he had wanted to live like Achilles. Now he learned what it meant to lose Patroclus. He ordered extensive mourning. He sought religious guidance about what honors Hephaestion could receive. Eventually, heroic honors were granted. An enormous memorial and funeral were planned. Some ancient accounts attribute even more extreme actions to Alexander during this period, and not every detail can be accepted confidently, but the scale of his grief is difficult to doubt. Alexander responded to loss the same way he responded to almost everything, by making it enormous. If grief could be given architecture, he would build it. If memory could be commanded, he would command it. If death could not be reversed, perhaps remembrance could be made permanent. But nothing worked. Hephaestion remained dead. This was not Hephaestion. Alexander could not wait for the answer to change. It was not Tyre. There was no wall to break. It was not Persia. There was no enemy to pursue. For perhaps the first time in his life, Alexander faced something that could not be transformed by will. Death did not care how much he wanted. The loss exposed something that conquest had increasingly hidden. Alexander was lonely. Not alone, lonely. There is a difference. He was surrounded, constantly. Officers, servants, guards, ambassadors, priests, administrators, soldiers, petitioners, people who praised him, people who feared him, people who needed something from him. But very few could approach him without first approaching the king. Hephaestion belonged to a smaller world, a world before the empire. before every conversation carried political weight, before disagreement could become treason, before praise became difficult to distinguish from survival. Power had given Alexander almost everything, but power could not manufacture another person who had known him before he possessed it. Perhaps that was Hephaestion's greatest importance. He did not merely know Alexander the Great, he knew Alexander. There was also something unique about their relationship in a life defined by competition. Alexander competed with Philip, with Darius, with Achilles, with Heracles, with dead conquerors, with geography itself. He measured himself constantly. Hephaestion does not appear in the story as someone Alexander needed to surpass. He stood beside him, for a man who turned almost everything into a test that may have been extraordinarily rare. Now that place was empty. Alexander did not stop. He almost never did. Soon after Hephaestion's death, he campaigned against the Cassians in the mountains. Ancient writers later connected the campaign to Hephaestion's death, sometimes portraying it as a kind of funeral offering. There were also strategic reasons for the operation, and we should be careful not to reduce military policy to grief. But psychologically, the pattern is familiar. Alexander responded to pain with movement. When Philip died, he moved. When Greece rebelled, he moved. When Darius fled, he pursued. When resistance appeared, he attacked. Action restored control. Grief could not be conquered, but perhaps it could be outrun. So Alexander kept moving. And yet, Hephaestion's absence followed him. There was nowhere far enough east to escape it. No victory capable of reversing it. No new title that could make it smaller. Alexander had spent years behaving as though sufficient will could force the world to yield. Hephaestion's death taught him otherwise. A king could command thousands of men. He could decide whether cities lived or burned. He could move populations, raise armies, build fleets. But he could not order one man to remain alive. For all the divine imagery surrounding Alexander, grief returned him violently to the human condition. He could lose someone, and nothing he possessed could protect him from that. Soon Alexander would return to Babylon. There were ships waiting, armies to organize, Arabia to explore, new campaigns to plan. From the outside, Alexander's life would appear to resume its familiar direction, forward. But something fundamental had changed. For most of his life, Alexander had been chasing something. Philip, Achilles, Darius, Persia, the edge of the world. Now the men who had defined those pursuits were gone. Philip was dead. Darius was dead. Cletus was dead. Hephaestion was dead. And the soldiers who had followed him to India had already shown that even they possessed a boundary Alexander could not cross. He had reached the edge of the world he knew. He had become greater than the father he once feared he could never surpass. He had achieved the kind of fame Achilles had promised. He had conquered the empire that had once seemed impossibly large. And still he needed another destination. Perhaps because stopping now would mean confronting a question Alexander had spent his entire adult life avoiding. If there was no enemy left to defeat, no father left to surpass, no hero left to chase, and no Hephaestion beside him, who was Alexander when there was nowhere left to go? Alexander had spent almost his entire adult life at war, not preparing for war, not recovering from war at war. From the moment he became king, there had always been another revolt, another enemy, another kingdom, another horizon. Thebes, Persia, Darius, Bactria, Sogdiana, India. Even when one campaign ended, another began before the dust had settled. War had not simply become Alexander's profession. It had become the structure of his life. And that creates an uncomfortable question. What would Alexander have been without it? A ruler, an administrator, a husband, a father, a king sitting in a palace while governors sent reports from distant provinces. There is little in Alexander's life to suggest that such a future excited him. He was capable of administration. He understood logistics, taxation, appointments, roads, garrisons, ports, supply lines, and political alliances. His campaigns would have been impossible without that ability. But conquest gave him something administration could not: intensity, clarity, a destination, an enemy, a test. In war, Alexander always knew what came next. Cross the river, take the city, defeat the king, keep moving. Peace was more complicated. Peace asked a different question. Now that you have won, what are you supposed to do with victory? By the time Alexander returned west from India, he had already acquired almost everything he once needed to prove himself. Philip had been surpassed. Darius had been defeated. Persia belonged to him. His armies had crossed farther east than any Macedonian force before them. Even his soldiers had finally forced him to stop. He had reached a point where continued conquest was no longer necessary to establish his greatness. And still he began preparing for another campaign, Arabia. There were strategic reasons. The Arabian coastline connected the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and important trade routes. Control of the region could strengthen communication between different parts of Alexander's empire. He ordered ships built, ports prepared, reconnaissance undertaken, troops gathered. The campaign was not merely fantasy. It was being organized. But psychologically, Arabia also offered something Alexander had always needed: a next step. Hephaestion was dead. The army had turned back from India. The Great Persian War was over. Alexander needed a direction, and Arabia gave him one. Perhaps that is why conquest had become so difficult for him to abandon. It protected him from stillness. Stillness might have forced Alexander to confront the empire he had created, and the empire was fragile. Alexander had conquered territory faster than stable institutions could develop. For years, he had been far away. Governors ruled provinces without seeing him. Some became corrupt. Others behaved as though Alexander might never return. Money disappeared. Local power hardened. When Alexander came back from India, he began investigating. Officials were removed. Some were punished. Others fled. The king was reasserting control. This exposed a fundamental difference between conquest and rule. A battle can be won in a day. An empire must be governed every morning afterward. Taxes must be collected, roads maintained, soldiers paid, local elites managed, religious customs respected or negotiated, rebellions prevented, succession prepared. Alexander had been extraordinarily successful at creating political movement. But now movement had to become stability, and stability was harder, because much of the empire still depended on one man. Alexander. Macedonian officers obeyed him. Persian nobles cooperated because of him. Greek cities feared or respected him. Local rulers negotiated with him. His personality held together people who did not necessarily trust one another. Victory had created the empire, but victory was not a constitution. What happened when Alexander was gone? There was no clear answer. Succession remained dangerously unresolved. Alexander had no adult son ready to inherit. Roxana was pregnant in the final months of his life. Her child had not yet been born. Alexander's half-brother Aridaeus existed, but he was not regarded as capable of ruling independently. There were generals, powerful generals, men with armies, ambition, and experience, but no universally accepted heir. This is one of the strangest contrasts in Alexander's final year. He could plan expeditions around coastlines he had never seen. He could reorganize armies across continents. He could decide the fate of governors thousands of kilometers away. Yet he had not created a stable answer to the most basic problem every mortal ruler eventually faces. Who comes next? Perhaps the reason was simple. Alexander was 32. He expected time. Why would a man barely into his 30s organize his empire around death? Especially a man who had survived so many encounters with it. Swords, arrows, disease, deserts, sieges, cold rivers, battlefields. Again and again, Alexander had approached death and returned. He understood mortality, but he may not have felt that mortality applied urgently to him. Tomorrow still seemed available. His empire itself was also becoming something new. Alexander no longer seemed interested in ruling Asia as a purely Macedonian possession. He incorporated Persian nobles, trained Persian soldiers, encouraged marriages across elite groups, adopted elements of local court practice, respected different religious traditions when politically useful or personally meaningful. This could be understood as pragmatic imperialism. It could also be understood as a broader political vision. Alexander was creating a system in which conquered peoples did not simply disappear beneath Macedonian rule. They entered the structure. But this openness had a paradox. The empire was becoming more culturally inclusive. Alexander's personal authority was becoming more absolute. Different peoples could retain identities. Different elites could serve. Different customs could coexist. But Alexander remained at the center. The system grew more diverse. The king grew more singular. Perhaps that was the only way he knew to imagine unity. Not through institutions stronger than the ruler. Through a ruler strong enough to contain everyone. That model worked while Alexander lived. It was much less clear what happened afterward. By now, Alexander was also living inside his own legend. This may have been one of the strangest psychological conditions of his final years. Most great men become myths after death. Alexander was becoming one while still alive. Priests associated him with divine ancestry. Artists idealized him. Poets praised him. Soldiers told stories about him. Enemies exaggerated his invincibility. Cities bore his name. Foreign delegations came to his court. The historical Alexander and the imagined Alexander were beginning to overlap. And a legend is difficult to live inside. A legend cannot become ordinary. It cannot admit that it is tired. It cannot say enough. Alexander the man may have wanted rest. Alexander the Great could not appear to need it. The name demanded continuation. Another campaign, another achievement, another proof that the story was still moving. Perhaps this is part of what success had done to him. He had become trapped inside the identity he had spent years constructing. Then there was Hephaestion. Before Hephaestion's death, Alexander had at least one person who belonged to the old world. Afterward, the palace must have felt different. There were still thousands around him. But the person who had known him before greatness was gone. Alexander continued planning Hephaestion's memorial. Orders were issued, honors discussed, architecture imagined, grief translated into imperial scale. He could not save her, so he tried to preserve him. This may also help explain Alexander's own obsession with memory. Death was unavoidable. Obscurity was not. Achilles had died, but his name remained. Hephaestion had died. Alexander could still make his name remain. Perhaps this was what Alexander had been chasing all along. Not immortality of the body, immortality of memory. Ancient writers also surround Alexander's final return to Babylon with omens, warnings from Chaldean priests, strange events, unfavorable signs. Later generations loved these stories because Alexander's death seemed too important to arrive without warning. The universe itself had to know. But perhaps the more revealing truth is simpler. Alexander did not behave like a man who believed the end was near. He planned, organized, inspected, commanded, looked ahead. Arabia was waiting, and beyond Arabia, perhaps other campaigns. Ancient sources later attributed enormous Western ambitions to him. Some may be exaggerated. Some may reflect projects only loosely discussed. But the exact geography matters less than the direction of Alexander's mind. Outward, always outward. The map still contained empty spaces. As long as an empty space existed, Alexander could imagine entering it. This is why asking whether Alexander intended to conquer the entire world may be the wrong question. The ancient world had no complete map of the world. Alexander himself did not know where a final edge might lie. There was no last city that could guarantee completion. Every horizon created another horizon. So the deeper question is not whether he possessed a literal plan for universal conquest. It is whether Alexander was capable of deciding that what he already had was enough. His life suggests that he struggled with the idea. Enough territory, enough glory, enough danger, enough proof. Every achievement solved one problem and created another. Could he defeat Persia? Yes. Could he take its throne? Yes. Could he go beyond Persia? Yes. Could he reach India? Yes. Could he continue beyond the Hephaestion? No. So he turned back and prepared for Arabia. Ambition behaves strangely when it becomes identity. Yesterday's victory no longer satisfies today's need. The achievement fades. The hunger remains. Perhaps this is the tragedy hidden inside extraordinary ambition. Ambition makes the present insufficient. There is always a greater version of yourself ahead. A larger victory. A more impressive future. For most people, life eventually interrupts that logic. Failure, responsibility, age, family, exhaustion. Alexander escaped many of those interruptions. Success protected his ambition from reality. When he demanded more, the world often gave him more. So he learned to demand again. What began as the desire of a prince to prove himself became something almost impossible to satisfy. Philip's shadow had disappeared years earlier. Alexander kept moving. Achilles had been dead for centuries. Alexander kept competing. Darius was gone. The war continued. Even Hephaestion's death could not end the need for a next campaign. Perhaps by now the destination mattered less than the movement itself. Alexander needed a future conquest in order to understand the present. And that left him with one question he had never been forced to answer. Who was Alexander when there was nothing left to conquer? He would never find out, because in Babylon, during the summer of 323 BC, his body began to fail. At first, there was no reason to believe this illness would be different from the others. Alexander had recovered before. He had always recovered before. His ships were waiting. His officers were waiting. Arabia was waiting. The next campaign was waiting. But this time, Alexander would not reach it. Babylon had seen conquerors before. Kings had entered through its gates. Empires had risen around it. Dynasties had vanished. The city was older than Macedonia's power and far older than Alexander's legend. In 323 BC, Alexander stood there as the most powerful ruler of his age. He was 32 years old, and still looking forward. Babylon could have become the center of a settled empire, a place from which Alexander finally ruled what he had conquered. Instead, it became another staging ground. Ships gathered, troops were organized, supplies accumulated. Arabia remained the next objective. Alexander did not arrive in Babylon preparing for death. He arrived preparing to move again. Then came the illness. Ancient sources differ about the precise sequence of events. Some place Alexander at a banquet hosted by Medius of Larissa shortly before the fever began. Heavy drinking appears in several traditions, though it is impossible to reconstruct every detail with certainty. What matters is that Alexander became sick. At first, this was not extraordinary. He had been ill before, seriously ill. During earlier campaigns, fever had nearly killed him. He had survived. He had survived wounds that seemed worse. Why should this be different? So life continued. Alexander issued orders, performed religious duties, discussed preparations. The Arabian campaign remained real, but the fever remained too. Then it worsened. Day by day, Alexander became weaker. The man who had marched across continents began struggling to move through a palace. Eventually, he had to be carried. And still the machinery of empire continued around him. Officers waited for instructions. Ships remained ready. The campaign existed as though illness were only a temporary delay. Alexander had been conditioned by his own life to expect obstacles to yield. This one did not. For more than 2,000 years, people have tried to explain what killed him: malaria, typhoid fever, other infections, complications related to drinking, poison, various modern medical theories. None can be established with certainty from the surviving evidence. The ancient descriptions are incomplete. The sources disagree, and some were written long after the event. Poison became especially attractive to later storytellers because ordinary disease seemed too small for Alexander. A man like this should require an assassin, a conspiracy, a final enemy. There were certainly people who had reasons to fear him. Alexander had executed powerful men, removed governors, created enemies, returned from India determined to restore control over officials who had grown comfortable in his absence. Later stories accuse figures such as Antipater and even connected Aristotle to elaborate poisoning plots. There is no convincing evidence proving such a conspiracy. A natural illness remains entirely plausible, and perhaps that possibility is more powerful than the legend. No king defeated Alexander. No army destroyed him. No heroic enemy rose at the end. His body simply stopped cooperating. Something too small to appear on a battlefield may have done what the Persian Empire could not. As Alexander weakened, rumors spread among the soldiers. The king was dying. Some feared he might already be dead, and that the truth was being hidden. These men had followed him for years. They had seen him wounded, bleeding, exhausted, feverish, and then alive again. Alexander recovering had become familiar. Alexander dying was something else. He had become the constant around which their lives were organized. For more than a decade, they had marched because Alexander moved, fought because Alexander decided where the enemy was, waited because Alexander had another destination. Now they stood outside a room in Babylon. According to several ancient traditions, the soldiers demanded to see him. Eventually, they were allowed to pass, one by one. Alexander could no longer address them as he once had. He reportedly acknowledged them with slight movements or with his eyes. It is one of the quietest scenes in his entire life. No cavalry, no speeches, no cities burning, no oracle, no divine ceremony. Only soldiers walking past the bed of the man they had followed to the edge of their world. The men who had once refused Alexander at the Hephaestion could do nothing now. Neither could his generals, neither could his wealth, neither could the empire. For once, everyone in the room possessed the same amount of power over what was happening. None, and hovering over the room, was a question. Alexander had left dangerously unresolved. Who would inherit everything? Ancient tradition preserves a famous answer. When asked to whom he left the empire, Alexander supposedly replied, "To the strongest." It is an extraordinary line, perhaps too extraordinary. Historians have long doubted whether he truly said it. Other traditions preserve different details, and Alexander's condition may already have made speech difficult. But the line survived because it sounded like Alexander. To the strongest, a world taken through power would now be divided by power. Whether Alexander said it or not, the future would behave as though he had. Roxana was pregnant. A possible son had not yet been born. Aridaeus remained a potential royal figure, but not a strong, independent ruler. Alexander's generals commanded men. Governors controlled provinces. Everyone understood military power. No one possessed Alexander's unquestioned position, and there was no mechanism capable of replacing him. For all his planning, Alexander had built an empire whose final institution was himself. Now that institution was dying. In June of 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon. He was 32 years old, only weeks away from his 33rd birthday. No final battle, no duel, no last conquest. The man who had spent his life moving died in a room. Outside, everything remained unfinished. The fleet remained, the army remained, Arabia remained. Orders had been given for a campaign Alexander would never see. Maps still contained empty spaces, but the force that had driven the entire machine forward was gone. For perhaps the first time since Alexander became king, no one knew where the empire was supposed to move next. His commanders had spent years asking, "What does Alexander want?" Now there was no answer, and for a brief moment, the world Alexander created simply waited. The ships were ready. Arabia was beyond the horizon. Alexander had always moved toward what came next. But this time, the horizon remained where it was. So who was Alexander? After more than 2,000 years, the simplest question may still be the hardest one. A military genius. Certainly, a visionary, at times, a tyrant. To many of the people who resisted him, absolutely. A man ahead of his time. In some ways, a man completely shaped by his own age. Without question. But none of these descriptions is enough. Because Alexander was built from contradictions. He could be extraordinarily generous and terrifyingly cruel. He could respect a defeated king and destroy a resisting city. He could share hardship with exhausted soldiers and lead those same soldiers into suffering they no longer wanted. He could embrace foreign cultures while demanding almost unlimited personal obedience. He could forgive enemies and kill friends. He could command thousands of men with extraordinary discipline, and sometimes fail to command himself. Perhaps this is why Alexander remains so difficult to reduce to either hero or monster. He was capable of being both, sometimes within the same life, sometimes within the same day. The Alexander remembered by history is usually constructed from victories. Granicus, Issus, Tyre, Gaugamela, Persepolis, Hydaspes, placed one after another. The names create the illusion that everything was inevitable. It was not. Alexander never knew the ending, At the Granicus, a weapon came close to ending the entire story before it had properly begun. In India, an arrow almost did the same. Illness eventually succeeded where weapons had failed. History makes Alexander look destined because we already know what happened. Alexander lived forward, like everyone else. He made decisions without knowing whether they would become triumphs or disasters. He simply accepted levels of risk that most rulers would not, and remarkably often, the risk was rewarded. That shaped him, perhaps more than anything else. Because failure teaches limits, Alexander experienced surprisingly little of it. Again and again, the world appeared to confirm his instincts. Attack, win, continue, take the risk, survive, go farther. And so he did. The pattern had begun long before Persia. Philip gave Alexander his first standard. His father transformed Macedonia, built its military power, defeated its rivals, dominated Greece, prepared the invasion of Asia. Alexander inherited almost everything that made his later victories possible. The army, the officers, the political position, even the Persian campaign itself. Without Philip, there may never have been an Alexander the Great, but inheritance created its own burden. Alexander did not want merely to continue Philip's story. He needed one of his own. So he went farther. Philip conquered Greece. Alexander broke Persia. Philip planned to cross into Asia. Alexander reached India. By the time Alexander stood in Persepolis, the comparison was over. He had surpassed his father, but the need to surpass did not disappear with Philip. It simply found new objects. Achilles, Heracles, Darius, the edge of the known world. Alexander spent much of his life competing with men who were either dead or impossible to reach, and this may have been one of the secrets of his ambition. A dead rival can never admit defeat. There is always one more thing to prove. From Olympias and the heroic traditions surrounding his family came another idea, that Alexander was not ordinary. We cannot know exactly what his mother told him. We cannot know precisely what he believed about Zeusammon or divine ancestry. But Alexander grew up in a world where extraordinary destiny was imaginable. Then reality began rewarding that imagination. He survived. He won. Kings fled before him. Cities carrying his name appeared across the map. Priests received him. Armies followed him. At some point, the difference between believing you are exceptional and repeatedly being shown that you are exceptional becomes difficult to separate. And this may be why Alexander's self-belief was so powerful. It was not built only from fantasy. He really had done extraordinary things. The danger was what those achievements taught him, that limits existed primarily to be challenged. This belief created some of his greatest moments. It also created some of his worst. The refusal to accept impossibility helped him take Tyre. The same refusal made it difficult for him to recognize when his men had suffered enough. It gave him courage at the Granicus. It also helped him leap almost alone into an enemy city. It carried him across Asia. It carried his army into Gedrosia. Alexander's greatest strength and greatest weakness may have come from the same place. He did not know how to leave a boundary unquestioned. And yet Alexander was not simply a machine for conquest. There was curiosity in him, flexibility, an ability to learn from the societies he defeated. He did not attempt to erase every culture that came under his control. Persian elites entered his administration. Local institutions survived. Foreign soldiers entered his armies. Marriage became part of imperial policy. Religious traditions were often accommodated. The king who crossed into Asia as a Macedonian changed as Asia changed around him. This was one of the reasons some of his own soldiers became suspicious. They believed Alexander was becoming too Persian. Perhaps Alexander believed he was becoming something larger than either Macedonian or Persian, a ruler whose identity could contain both. There was something ambitious in that vision, possibly even something genuinely new, but it contained a contradiction. Alexander's empire could become more culturally inclusive, while Alexander himself became more politically central. Many peoples could belong inside the system, but the system still depended on one man. Alexander could imagine an empire larger than Macedonia. He never fully solved how that empire could become larger than Alexander. His death exposed the weakness immediately, nor can the violence be removed from his story. Thebes was destroyed. Tyre suffered terribly. Campaigns in Central Asia became brutal. Philotas was executed. Parmenion was killed. Callisthenes died in captivity. Cletus died by Alexander's own hand. The people who suffered under his campaigns did not experience Alexander as a fascinating psychological puzzle. For many, he was catastrophe. This matters because greatness can distort historical memory. We see arrows moving across maps. People living inside those arrows saw armies entering their homes. We remember the conqueror. The conquered often become numbers. Alexander's achievements were extraordinary. So was their cost. Neither truth cancels the other. But violence was only one side of his emotional world. Alexander could form intense attachments. Bucephalus mattered to him. His soldiers mattered to him. Olympias mattered to him. And Hephaestion mattered perhaps more than anyone. This is where Alexander becomes most recognizably human. The conqueror who seemed incapable of stopping could be stopped by grief. When Cletus died by his hand, Alexander's remorse appears to have been real. When Hephaestion died, Alexander could not simply command himself through the loss. His grief became enormous. Ceremonies, honors, memorials, orders. The machinery of empire was turned toward mourning. But for once, power had no useful answer. Alexander could defeat kings. He could not reverse death. He could build monuments. He could not bring Hephaestion back. And perhaps this was the cruelest lesson Alexander ever received. There are things we cannot change. For a man whose entire life had taught him the opposite, that realization must have been unbearable. Power also isolated him. Not because Alexander lacked people around him. He was almost never alone. But fewer and fewer people could approach him without first approaching the king. Philip was gone. Parmenion was gone. Cletus was gone. Hephaestion was gone. The men who remembered Alexander before the title great became fewer with every year. There is a difference between admiration and intimacy, between obedience and friendship, between being surrounded and being known. Hephaestion may have been one of the last men who did not simply see the ruler of Asia. He saw Alexander. When he died, the empire became larger than ever. Alexander's personal world became smaller. That may be one of the strangest costs of extraordinary power. The more people beneath you, the fewer people beside you. We should resist giving Alexander a modern psychological diagnosis. It would be easy. Narcissist, megalomaniac, psychopath, manic. Such words create certainty, where the evidence does not allow it. Alexander lived more than 2,000 years ago. Our sources are incomplete. They were written by authors with political, moral, and literary agendas of their own. We cannot know what Alexander thought in private. We cannot know what frightened him at night. We cannot know whether he ever looked at what he had become and wondered if he had gone too far. But patterns remain. He was intensely competitive. highly emotional, deeply sensitive to glory and insult, capable of enormous loyalty, capable of terrifying rage, unusually tolerant of physical risk, and almost incapable of remaining still. That does not diagnose Alexander, it simply gives us a man. And the man is more interesting than the diagnosis. Perhaps the greatest unanswered question is what Alexander would have become if he had lived. He was only 32. Suppose the fever disappeared. Suppose Arabia fell. What then? Would he continue west? Would he finally stop expanding? Would age make him more cautious? Would he become a builder rather than a conqueror? Could his cultural integration policies have created a durable imperial identity? Would his court become even more absolute? Would another Cletus eventually challenge him? Would one catastrophic defeat finally teach him caution? There is no answer, and perhaps that uncertainty protects his legend. There is no old Alexander, no elderly king looking back on his youth. No slow decline, no retirement, no final reconciliation with limits. History froze him while he was still moving, still planning, still unfinished. Death preserved the most powerful version of Alexander, the man on the way to somewhere else. His empire did not remain united. His generals fought over it. His family failed to secure it. The political structure fractured. In that sense, Alexander's project did not survive him, but the world he created did. Cities linked regions that had once seemed unimaginably distant from one another. Greek language and institutions spread through large parts of the Eastern, Daunian, and Western Asia. Existing cultures mixed with them rather than simply disappearing. Trade expanded. Ideas traveled. Art changed. New kingdoms emerged from Alexander's conquests and shaped centuries of history. Alexander failed to build an empire that could survive as one state. Yet he transformed the world that survived him, and perhaps more importantly, to Alexander himself. His name survived too. This was the immortality Achilles had promised. Not immortality of the body, immortality of memory. Alexander had spent his youth admiring a hero whose name had outlived his death. Then Alexander became that kind of name. Roman generals studied him. Emperors compared themselves to him. Persian traditions reshaped him. Medieval storytellers transformed him. Poets, kings, and historians argued over him. For centuries, ambitious men measured themselves against Alexander. The boy who once chased Achilles eventually became the standard other conquerors chased. Perhaps that was his greatest victory. Not Persia, not India, time. And even there, the victory was incomplete. Because immortality through memory has a price. People remember the legend. The man becomes harder to see. Alexander spent his life trying to become unforgettable. He succeeded so completely that the story almost swallowed the person. So perhaps we should leave the legend behind for one final moment. Not Alexander at Gaugamela. Not Alexander entering Babylon. Not Alexander before the oracle at Siwa. Just Alexander, 32 years old. Philip long dead, Hephaestion gone, his soldiers exhausted, his ships waiting, Arabia ahead. Behind him lay almost everything he had, once needed to prove himself. Macedonia, Greece, Egypt, Persia, Babylon, Central Asia, India. Kings defeated. Cities founded. An empire larger than anything he had inherited. A name already becoming legend. For another man, it might have looked like enough. Alexander was still looking at the empty part of the map. Perhaps that is the closest we can come to understanding him. Maybe he was moving toward glory. Maybe away from Philip's shadow. Maybe toward Achilles. maybe away from becoming ordinary. Maybe, after enough years, even Alexander no longer knew the difference. He simply knew how to move forward, until his soldiers stopped him, until grief stopped him, until his body stopped him. Alexander conquered armies, kings, cities, mountains, deserts, an empire that had once seemed too large to challenge. But there was one thing he never learned to conquer, the part of himself that always needed more. And perhaps that is why his story remains strangely familiar. Most of us will never command armies. We will never rule kingdoms. We will never stand at the edge of the known world, wondering what lies beyond it. But we know the voice. One more achievement, one more victory, one more horizon. Then I will be satisfied. Alexander followed that voice farther than almost anyone in history, and discovered what it never tells us. There is always another horizon. Alexander spent his life trying to reach the edge of the world, perhaps because stopping would have forced him to face the one place he could never conquer himself.